Good evening, everyone. It's great to see so many of you once again. I'm always pleased when I see a packed room. And of course, tonight we have a particularly exciting event, though I'd say that every time we meet here. We have a roundtable on the Middle East, and we have two distinguished former ambassadors who were based in the region for a long time. They will give us their insights. And please, as I said before, please don't forget to watch our YouTube channel. Please sign up to the mailing list, and also occasionally have a look at our website for the latest information. I'm Klaus Lauers, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Our first speaker today is Ambassador David Litt, and the other speaker is Ambassador Mark Sievers. Ambassador David Litt is a very good friend of the Krasno events. He luckily lives locally, and he comes and tries to be with us as often as he can. David Litt was ambassador to the United Arab Emirates, and he was special advisor to Central Command in Florida afterwards. But he also had many other postings in the Middle East or in the State Department in DC, which were connected with the Middle East. So he served, for example, in Kabul, many years in Syria, in Baghdad, and many other places all over the world, and particularly in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. So it's great to have David Litt with us tonight. Then there's Ambassador Mark Sievers. Mark Sievers has just arrived from Oman, and I'm immensely grateful that he took the long journey over 16 hours here to get to us. And he may be a little jet-lagged, but I'm very pleased that you were able to make it. Ambassador Sievers was U.S. ambassador to Oman between 2016 and November 2019. So he only just retired from the Foreign Service. He has decades of experience in the Middle East. He was based in Baghdad as well. He was deputy ambassador in Cairo. He was in Algiers. He was in Tel Aviv, and in many other places in the Middle East and round about the world. And of course, his insights on the Gulf area, on Oman, and the other parts of the Middle East we will talk about tonight will be essential for our panel tonight. So I would suggest that we start with Ambassador David Litt, who also has a nice PowerPoint presentation for us. After that, Ambassador Sievers will talk to us, and each of them will talk for roughly 20-25 minutes max, I would say. And then we'll retire to the stage, and I will ask a few simple questions to the two ambassadors, and then we'll open it up to your exciting and engaged questions. And of course, as in the past, we will have as many questions as we possibly can have tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ambassador David Litt and Ambassador Mark Sievers tonight.
Good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to be ambidextrously moving two different slide projections and all of that. But bear with me because I think I can manage it, at least I hope. My wife, Beatrice, and I came back January 30th from a cruise in the Middle East. And we went through the Suez Canal, down the Red Sea, into very dangerous zones, through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait by Yemen, through the Somali pirate war zone, around the Strait of Hormuz, into the dangerous Persian Gulf, into Dubai. And we were sure this was going to be an extraordinarily dangerous trip, and we had military escorts, and we had armed guards on board, and blackout lights and all of that. It's a good thing that we didn't go anywhere near China, because all of those military guards and military escorts would have been absolutely, positively useless. So, I had developed on board the cruise several lectures that I've now consolidated down into this presentation for this evening. Just felicitously, I think it covers the topic that we're going to be working on, Islam and the conflict in the Middle East, and I'm going to focus on the Persian Gulf region, which I think Mark will be doing as well, and especially on this region's three principal adversaries: Saudi Arabia, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the United States. And what I'm going to do is to look at some of the origins of the conflict in the Gulf region, especially between Iran and Saudi Arabia, that tension, that dynamic, and then how the varied roles and interests of the United States in the region played into that conflict. But to do that, we have to go back to the beginning. Islam burst on the scene in the middle of the 7th century, pretty much out of nowhere, like the Big Bang theory of the origins of the universe. And Islam's advocates very successfully captured not just the Arabian Peninsula, but also much of the Byzantine and Persian empires in a couple of decades, really. And then went on to occupy all of North Africa and into the Iberian Peninsula in the next 100 years. And they succeeded largely for two reasons. The first was the appeal of the message to disaffected populations who were looking for a lot of answers. And then secondly, also through force and coercion over any resistant and rebellious groups that they found along the way, and there were many of them. And at the beginning, this involved the efforts of the Prophet Muhammad himself and his forces, and then the leadership of the later caliphs, especially Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr successfully unified the peninsula under the banner of Islam, quelling revolts by all sorts of tribes in the central desert region of the Nejd, and then along the Red Sea, Hijaz region, and then the rest of the peninsula submitted fairly quickly. And then when Abu Bakr succeeded the Prophet as caliph, he was not unopposed. The supporters of Ali, who was the cousin and the son-in-law of Muhammad, argued that the succession should come by bloodline, by family, not by some election. The Umayyads, an aristocratic and very wealthy clan of Mecca, argued instead that it was wealth and authority that should determine the succession of the Prophet. So we fast forward to the year 656, a series of caliphs, and then finally Ali, it's his turn, Ali becomes caliph. But he is now challenged by an Umayyad general, the governor of Damascus, in fact, and his name was Muawiyah. Ali, now caliph, moved the capital of this empire to this town of Kufa in present-day Iraq. Ali was assassinated by a fanatical and puritanical group of fundamentalists called the Kharijites. The Kharijites, this is a term that means those who leave or those who go out. Maybe sort of the antecedents of Brexiteers, I don't know. But the Kharijites were an extremely pious and devout group, and they believed that the succession of the caliphate should be determined by those who are the most pious and those who are the most respectable and, of course, the most politically and militarily savvy. Well, Ali was buried in the ancient city of Kufa, which became today's city of Najaf, and is one of the two holiest places for Shiite Islam. Well, Muawiyah is now without effective opposition. Ali is gone, and Muawiyah proclaims himself as caliph in Jerusalem. And he forced Ali's son Hussein, the rival caliph in Iraq, to abdicate. But Ali's supporters were not going to go that quickly. They continued to believe that it was Ali's line that was the legitimate succession to the caliph. Muawiyah and those Umayyads, they're just usurpers. And now the stage is set for brand new and violent confrontations. Muawiyah died in the year 680 AD, and Hussein and his troops rose up in revolt against the Umayyads. So Hussein traveled from Mecca to Kufa to engage in battle against the Umayyads. And that fateful battle took place in the town of Karbala. Hussein was attacked, he was killed, murdered in Karbala in that same year, 680, and Karbala is now the second other holy site for the Shiites, both of them in present-day Iraq. It was the murder of Hussein that created this permanent schism in Islam between the followers of the Umayyad succession, called Sunnis, colored in yellow on this slide, and the followers of Ali's succession, called the Shia, the partisans of Ali, colored in red. The name in this calligraphic shield introduced a new movement in Islam. It is a name with immediate relevance today to today's political environment, and it is the rise of Wahhabism. The name in the calligraphic shield is Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who was an Islamic scholar born in the middle of the 18th century. He was born in part of Central Arabia called the Najd, that desert area in Central Arabia. He studied in Medina and other centers of learning. And Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab became very critical of the lax practices of Islam as he saw them. Like the Harijites before him, he formulated a fundamentalist doctrine. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab railed against the relatively new, very tolerant, very rationalist, very scientific developments that had arisen in the Abbasid Empire from about 750 AD to 1250 AD. But his views were not particularly popular in Medina, so he was exiled from there and fled to the town of Dir'iyah near present-day Riyadh. In fact, I think the diplomatic quarter is built on the area of where Dir'iyah is. And it was there that Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab formed an alliance with the ruler in Dir'iyah, and the name of the ruler was Muhammad bin Saud. And according to the agreement of these two Muhammads, the Al Sauds would dominate the political domain, and the Wahhabis would dominate the religious domain in whatever political thing they were able to set up. And they did. Together they spread their influence and authority outward from Dir'iyah, obtaining allegiances with all kinds of tribes in the local areas, either through persuasion or through coercion, sometimes both, much like the Caliph Abu Bakr had done at the dawn of Islam 1,000 years earlier. And the Wahhabi-Saud political alliance in Central Arabia remained for the next 300 years, well into the 20th century. And that alliance allowed this man, Sheikh Abdulaziz bin Saud, a descendant of Muhammad bin Saud, to create the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in 1932 and establish his line as the royal succession in the kingdom up to this day in partnership with the Wahhabi religious establishment. Then the next year, 1933, oil arrived on the scene, and so did the United States of America. And in 1933, King Abdulaziz granted an oil exploration concession to Standard Oil of California, SoCal, in order to explore for oil in the eastern portion of the kingdom. They were successful, and the first oil was spudded in the latter part of the 1930s. And then toward the end of World War II, King Abdulaziz met with President Franklin Roosevelt aboard the American warship, the USS Quincy, in the Suez Canal, actually in the Great Bitter Lake, if any of you have been there. And together they formed that very famous partnership which guaranteed American access to Saudi oil in return for American support for the kingdom. And this Saudi-American friendship evolved gradually over the years, but it's based on that single fact that Saudi Arabia is one of the world's major producers of oil and gas. And both nations shared a common interest in maintaining the unfettered flow of oil at stable prices through that region. And at the same time, the United States would come to dominate Saudi economic and industrial development in its hydrocarbon sector. And as a result, the United States developed a very strong and abiding interest in the rule of the House of Saud. Then in the 1970s, a very interesting development occurred. The United Kingdom, that had been guaranteeing peace and security in this region, suddenly decided that it was going to withdraw all of its political and military presence from east of Suez. Panic in the Persian Gulf. and Persia and stability and security responsibility was handed over to the United States of America to guarantee, again, that free flow of oil and other commerce in the Gulf. But to do this, the Nixon administration did not want to permanently send American forces in the region. He wanted to use his friend Saudi Arabia, or our friend Saudi Arabia, and Iran under the Shah as the guarantors, as proxies for the United States, guarantors of stability in the Gulf. Well, as we know, the U.S.-Saudi relationship was dealt a pretty serious blow in the Saudi-led oil embargo of 1973-74, and although the Saudi leadership tried to temper a bit some of the more radical oil producers in OPEC, the embargo left a very permanent and negative effect on the leadership in Washington about the credibility of Saudi Arabia as an ally. And then the Shah fell. And the rise of the Islamic Republic of Iran in 1979, instead of promoting stability in this region, led to increasing belligerence in the region. The Iran-Iraq War began with threats to shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, and now Washington changed its tune and changed its attitudes about this arm's length security relationship with the Gulf and created a much more robust, direct maritime military presence to preserve American interests as well as those of the global economy in the region. And as a consequence, in the 1980s, the Islamic Republic and also Sunni extremists in the region rose up to challenge this new American maritime military presence in the Gulf. And then in the 1990s, Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait and Operation Desert Storm in 1991 brought huge numbers of American ground forces into the region. And that was a move that was supported by Arab regimes, Sunni Arab regimes, but opposed by Sunni extremists and the Islamic Republic. And then 10 years later came the U.S. occupation of Iraq and the death of Saddam Hussein in 2003. And even though it was Tehran that benefited greatly from the removal of Iran's public enemy number one, Saddam Hussein, Iran continued to chafe at this huge American military presence next door in Iraq, and also, by the way, on the other side, on its eastern side, in Afghanistan. So the Iranians moved to strengthen their ties with Iraq's new Shiite regime. For their part, Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states did quite the opposite. They resisted supporting Iraq and its post-Saddam leadership because they were Shia, even though they were Arabs, like the Arab states of the Gulf. And they became, I would say, irritatingly quiet of Iraq. They refused to provide any kind of political or certainly not military or even economic support to Iraqi Shia, even though they were Arab, not Persian. And this attitude ultimately created this self-fulfilling prophecy that Iran would come to dominate Iraq's policies. Of late, some of the states of the Gulf, the Arab states of the Gulf, are trying to make up for lost time, but in many ways it really is too late. Before the Islamic Republic was established, the Saudi-Iranian rivalry mainly played out in oil markets, in OPEC councils for production and pricing policies, in geographic struggles, both for the domination of all these geological oil fields in the Gulf, but also for control of some of the islands in the center of the Strait of Hormuz. But perhaps most importantly, the Saudi-Iranian rivalry played out over the Shia minority populations, especially in Bahrain and the eastern provinces of Saudi Arabia. Sunni Arabs harbored these conspiratorial suspicions of Iranian interference and provocations with their Shia minorities. And in fact, there was some evidence of Iranian involvement with Shia populations in that part of Saudi Arabia and in particular Bahrain. And that was before the fall of the Shah. The rivalry then worsened under the Islamic Republic. And the Ayatollahs proclaimed a much more aggressive and assertive role to promote Shi'ism and to defend Shiite populations everywhere. It's a great cartoon. It says in the bottom, how long will this fight last? Only 14 or 15 centuries. 1979, a determinate year. It was the year that the Shah fled, the year of the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran was completed. It was the year of the occupation of the United States Embassy in Tehran, and it was also the year of the occupation of the Grand Mosque of Mecca in Saudi Arabia by militant fundamentalist Sunni extremists. In November of 1979, this man, Juhayman al-Utaybi, led a radical sect of several hundred insurgents who were protesting the corruption and excesses of the Al Saud family as unfit to be custodians of the holy places. Sounds kind of familiar. They demanded the return to purer Islam, much like the Kharijites had done before them, and much like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State would do after them. The siege of the mosque lasted 2 weeks, and the Saudis proved completely incapable of expelling these militants alone. They depended on Pakistani forces and also French forces to do the job for them. Word spread rapidly across the Muslim world of this event and of the presence of non-Muslim foreign forces, mainly French forces, inside the Grand Mosque of Mecca. In fact, allegations also spread that Americans were involved in the shootout at the Grand Mosque. And American embassies all around the region, to include where we were in Damascus at the time, were under real threat. Of course, in Damascus, under the autocracy of Hafez al-Assad, we weren't in any trouble at all, but the American embassy in Islamabad was burned to the ground. Well, since that fateful year of 1979, the Arab-Iranian rivalry escalated and took many forms. At the outset, both camps marshaled their resources to support adherence to their own individual causes. The Gulf Arabs, for their part, built and sustained Sunni religious schools called madrasas all throughout South Asia and Central Asia. And this was also a means to burnish Saudi Arabia's credentials as the real protectors of the holy sites of Islam in the wake of that humiliating occupation of the Grand Mosque of Mecca. The Islamic Republic, for its part, supported the growth of Lebanese Hezbollah, most notably, to advance the political interests of Shia in Lebanon, and also to burnish Iran's image as the defenders of Shiism. And within that same decade, within Sunni Islam, the Al-Qaeda movement grew, condemning the impurity of the Al Saud ruling family, just as Juhayman had done in 1979, and the Kharijites might have done against the Al Saud back in the 7th century had the Al Saud been around. In more recent times, Yemen has become a front line between Saudi Arabia and Iran, each side backing its own proxy forces. And this was not the first time that Yemen had become a battleground between two large regional powers. Saudi Arabia and Egypt fought a proxy war over Yemen in the 1960s. We can talk more about Yemen later. The United States and Iran are also continuing this military and militant standoff on the front lines in Syria and Iraq, each side trying to prevent the other from achieving any kind of dominance in either of those two countries. But I have to point out here that despite this very militant aggressiveness between the United States and Iran, it was not so long ago that the United States had worked very hard and diplomatically with global powers, and also with the help of Oman, which maybe Mark will talk about later, to deal much more effectively diplomatically with Iran to restrain Iran's nuclear ambitions with very significant success. Like it or not, the diplomacy achieved its objective in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA, until that agreement was shredded into pieces by the Trump administration. Of late, the clashes have resumed between the United States other countries, and Iran. Last year, cargo shipping was targeted. Saudi oil facilities have been targeted. Last month, Iranian General Soleimani of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard was assassinated. Iran retaliated against Americans in Iraq. Each side claimed to be a victim, and each side is unwilling to back down. As of today, the situation remains very fragile and fluid, but stability has to be resolved. There is no other way out. But how we do this is very complicated. And before I end, I'd just like to summarize where we have been. Islam is a global religion. And like all great religions, it has its hardliners and it has its moderates, those who demand unwavering allegiance and those who preach tolerance. In fact, Islam was born in both coerced obedience as well as open-armed acceptance of the promise of liberation and justice. The clash between Gulf Arabs and Iran, centuries old, and it's multidimensional, and it will be very difficult to remove these root causes of instability. But we have seen how miscommunications, misperceptions, like the burning of the embassy in Islamabad, continue to stoke baseless fears, which inevitably push the goal of stability in the Gulf, which is presumably our goal, even farther out into an indefinite future. And that would leave the region and the globe with a growing threat of miscalculation and potential conflict that will lead absolutely nowhere except greater disaster. My 2 cents, my take on this, is that the Arab states of the Gulf, the Islamic Republic of Iran, the United States of America, all have the experience and the capacity to engage in peaceful, if difficult diplomacy. And it's difficult because it is going to require patience and trust and skill and something called leadership. But a diplomatic outcome is far better than pursuing instability, not just to the current antagonists, but also to the region, to major global powers, and to the world at large. And with that, I yield my time.
Let's see if this is on. I'm going to turn this on. It's on now? Yeah, you hear me okay? I can speak up. I don't have a PowerPoint. Want to express my admiration for the PowerPoint that David Litt put together. I'd love to use some of those maps, but I'll just speak from a few notes. So I was ambassador to Oman during the last summer, and I want to build on David's presentation and talk about what it was like in the Gulf over the summer as the tensions escalated, largely between the United States and Iran, but also with the regional states playing a significant role. So the Trump administration withdrew from the JCPOA and launched what we've called the maximum pressure campaign against Iran. We resumed economic sanctions, which are enforced through the U.S. Department of Treasury, and the sanctions have in fact been even more effective than many people expected, largely because they ban transactions with Iran that either use dollar accounts or go through dollar accounts, and the risk to banks and to companies abroad, including the Europeans, of losing access to dollar accounts or to the American market far outweighs whatever political interest their government may have in preserving the nuclear agreement with Iran. So the Iranians found themselves under increasing economic pressure Starting in May, they began a campaign of escalation of their own to try to counter the maximum economic pressure being brought by the United States. So they set about sabotaging some oil tankers, first striking some tankers that were anchored off the coast of the United Arab Emirates, then striking some tankers that I think that were actually sailing through the Arabian Sea, but near the coast of Iran. Later in the summer, they seized a UK ship and forcibly towed it to Iranian port and held the crew for some weeks. And eventually, they launched cruise missile and missile strikes on the Saudi Aramco production facility at Al-Abqaiq inside Saudi Arabia, and tried to have the Houthi rebels in Yemen claim responsibility for the strikes. But I think it's been pretty definitively established that the Houthis didn't have the capacity to have carried out those strikes, and that they indeed were launched directly from Iranian territory. I believe that this is the first time that Iran has struck one of its neighbors directly since the Iran-Iraq war ended without going through a proxy. And in addition to that, there were multiple intelligence reports all through the summer about plans by Iranian proxies, mostly in Iraq, but also at some other places in the region, to attack U.S. facilities, whether diplomatic facilities or military facilities in the region. So the U.S. response was a naval buildup, mostly in the Arabian Sea. We sent a large carrier group, and I went out to they docked in the Omani port of Duqm for a little shore leave and repairs. Several times I went down there to visit them, and the Abraham Lincoln is an amazing projection of force, but to demonstrate our presence in the Arabian Sea. We coupled that with some maritime patrols, including the one that I assume accompanied your cruise ship through the Strait of Hormuz recently. And we built up our air assets in a couple of places that we have. Our major air facility in the region is actually in Qatar. That's kind of an irony. We'll get to the Qatar rift maybe in the question and answer session. But our major air presence in the region is in Qatar. But we also convinced the Saudis to dust off the Prince Sultan Air Base south of Riyadh so that it could be used by the U.S. Air Force as a way of deterring Iran, not as a way of preparing for an attack on Iran. At the time of the Iranian strike on the Aramco facility, the most notable thing that happened was there was no retaliation. And I think the Saudis, based on the long-standing arrangement going back to this meeting between President Roosevelt and King Abdulaziz on the Quincy, had every reason to expect that President Trump would order some sort of retaliatory strike once we had determined that the attack on the oil facility had actually come directly from the Iranians. But we didn't. And that raised quite a number of questions about what U.S. policy was. And I'll turn to that in a few minutes. But I think what's happened is that under the Trump administration, the U.S. Criteria for retaliation has to do with whether there are any American casualties or whether there are any American targets that are struck. And we seem much less interested in carrying out military operations of our own to retaliate on behalf of our Gulf allies. So that is creating a different set of pressures. At the same time, or shortly thereafter, I believe it was the 3rd of January, the administration decided to launch a drone strike on a convoy next to Baghdad airport that included the commander of the Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force, the external branch of the IRGC that is used to project Iranian power throughout the region. Its commander was a man named Qasem Soleimani, and he died along with some Iraqi militia leaders in that strike. And it seems to me that in some ways that changed the rules of the game. It's striking. Nobody knew, including the president, quite how the Iranians would react. Certainly there was an expectation that there would be retaliation. I was already retired and living in Muscat, and my wife for a while told me I couldn't walk the dog at night because the neighborhood we live in has lots of Iranians living in it, and she was afraid that somebody was going to kidnap me or kill me. But I actually wasn't too concerned about it. I thought if Iran was going to retaliate, that Oman was an unlikely place for them to take action, which fortunately turned out to be the case. And when the reaction came, no one wants to dismiss going through multiple missile bombardments on a hardened military base. But in fact, given the scope of things that Iran had the capacity to do in retaliation, that was a pretty restrained response. And I think that gets to perhaps, is there a technical? I lost it. I can just use this thing if this works.
Yeah, that fixed it.
All right. So it seems to me that talking to Iranian former officials and other Iranians I've encountered over the last few years in the Gulf, obviously unofficially, wasn't supposed to talk to them officially. There was a sense in Iran that because of their network of proxies in the region, because of the training and equipping that they had invested in these proxies, and because of their extensive network of ballistic missiles capable of hitting, certainly not the United States, but many of our bases and our allies and so forth, that they were effectively untouchable, and that there was really nothing. I think actually the Ayatollah made some remarks a few days before Soleimani was killed, saying that the United States couldn't do anything about the violent demonstrations that broke through the outer gate of our embassy in Baghdad because Iran was so powerful. So I will submit that killing Qasem Soleimani has at least forced the Iranians to reconsider whether they are indeed untouchable. Let me talk a little bit about the Omani perspective on all this, because Oman is kind of unique in the Gulf because of their contacts with Iran. They are also our partner in keeping the Strait of Hormuz open, and a very important and useful partner they are indeed. But they have long maintained the position that the Gulf needs a channel to Iran, that dialogue should not be closed off, and that dialogue can always be conducted by Oman until the time comes when the larger states of the Gulf decide that they want to talk to the Iranians as well. The Omanis also very much want to help promote a U.S.-Iran dialogue and a resumption of negotiations, and they made numerous efforts in the spring and the summer of last year, which didn't really go anywhere because we and the Iranians are kind of stuck in our own positions. President Trump has agreed to engage the Iranian leadership In fact, he's expressed interest in doing so. The Iranians have gone back and forth between first saying they had no interest in talking to him, and then that they would do so, but only if he would abandon the maximum pressure campaign before any engagement, which he has refused to do. So that's kind of where it stuck. And it appears to me that Iran is waiting for the U.S. Elections in November to see how that turns out. If there's a Democrat in the White House next year, we may have a very different policy toward Iran. But if President Trump is reelected, they will have to factor that into their considerations. Meanwhile, as all of these things have played out, it appears to me that views about Iran and the Gulf are evolving. The United Arab Emirates has acknowledged that they have had several what they call technical discussions with the Iranians, including an Emirati delegation that went to Tehran for the first time in I don't know how many years, but for quite a while. Their Minister of State, Anwar Gargash, recently tweeted that it's time to engage Iran. That's quite a different position. And what they tell us is that while they support the maximum pressure campaign, they also don't want to see it escalate into military action. And so they want the economic pressure, but they don't want too much military pressure. It seems likely to me that the Saudis are also considering what kind of dialogue and under what conditions they would support talking to Iran. And one of the Emiratis' talking points is if there is a resumed negotiation on the nuclear issue with Iran, with the United States, but also with other world powers, such as led to the JCPOA, that the Gulf states need to have a seat at the table so they can also participate in these talks. I'm not sure how that would work, but that's the idea. I think the Trump administration has also evolved in its views and is probably not opposed to the idea of a Gulf dialogue with Iran, provided that the channel is not the IRGC, which has been banned as an international terrorist organization. I think outcome of this is probably quite encouraging for the Omanis, who have long been the advocates of Arab dialogue, but we'll see where it all goes. It's probably premature. And one other point I'd like to note is that we're facing leadership changes throughout the region, and we don't know exactly what the impact of these is going to be. Oman just had its leadership change. Sultan Qaboos died on January 10th when the 40-day official mourning period just ended last week. And he was a remarkable figure. I had the great fortune of meeting him on a number of occasions, and he was quite a remarkable man. But he's gone, and he was very smoothly replaced by his cousin, now Sultan Haitham, who is very much focused on reviving the Omani economy and improving governance. And it looks like in Oman that is going to be the priorities, and diplomacy will largely be left to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the security services. So that's sort of interesting. But that's only one of numerous transitions that are coming. So Saudi Arabia is effectively led by its crown prince, but King Salman is still there. For about 2 years, people have been saying that Salman is going to abdicate and turn power over to his son. It hasn't happened yet. Saudi kings have a way of living on and holding on to power until they are so weakened that other people are actually running the country, but they are effectively still king. And that seems to be largely the case, but sooner or later Salman will die, and we'll see if Prince Mohammed indeed becomes the next king. Similarly, somewhat, and the system's a little different, but in the UAE, The Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Zayed, is still the Crown Prince. He's not the Emir, and that is playing out in Kuwait similarly. The Emir of Kuwait is ill and has been for years, and apparently the Crown Prince is also ill. So at some point they will have their transition. And on top of that, the supreme leader in Iran has cancer and is likely to die in the next, who knows when, but in the near future relatively. And we don't know quite how all of that will play out. So a lot waits to be seen. I think we're waiting for the outcome of the American presidential elections. We're waiting for the outcome of various leadership transitions. And hopefully, and I will agree with my friend David, that I think the chances are that there's enough wisdom around that this thing will not spin out of control in the interim period, but it could. So I will stop there and look forward to questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Let me ask you a few questions and then we open it up to the audience. And students do not have to leave, they are allowed to stay even now. When we look at the Middle East, and David gave us a very nice overview about the turmoil and instability over the last few decades and longer, so the region has been in turmoil and instability for quite some time. My question, why? Is there something wrong with the leadership in the Middle East? Are they inherently not capable of providing stability? Or what is the reason why?
You want to tackle that first?
Okay, I'll start. Does this one work?
Yeah.
I think we have multiple
It should
mics.
work.
Yes, it does. A combination of 3 or 4 major factors. One of the most important of which is that the Arab world, let's call it the Arab world, Middle East is, I think, is a better appellation, the Arab world, has suffered from being very low on the Human Development Index as the United Nations has charted it, in terms of education, in terms of economic development. The states of the Middle East, for example, don't trade with each other. They trade outside of the region. And educational growth and all of that. Political dynamics, political governance is very low. So that's one thing. A second thing is that the Middle East has suffered from the transition of governance from colonial powers to self-governing in a very difficult fashion, in large part because of the impact of the wars between Israel and Arab nations, where Arab nations, in many senses, used their antipathy toward Israel to justify their own role in power and authority in their countries, thereby sort of perpetuating this lack of good governance, all in the name of trying to effectuate a policy vis-a-vis Israel. The United States may not have played a very helpful role in some places and did play a helpful role in others. We had to play a balance between what we perceived as stability as a norm and a value, security, versus these issues of growth and human rights and proper education and the like. And we may not have achieved the balance all that well. So that's one aspect.
Okay, thanks very much. Mark, would you like to come in?
Yeah, this works better than the one in my pocket. I would agree with all of that. Let me toss out a couple of additional ideas. The Arab world has been divided since the period of independence, the 1940s and 50s, between monarchies, conservative monarchies, and largely military-led regimes that had a different agenda. It's compounded by the fact that Arab nationalism, as it developed, downplayed the significance of individual states and sought a united Arab world, which probably was never a very practical proposition, but probably undermined the development of good governance, especially when combined with this effort to contain or destroy Israel as a goal. So those factors played out, and what we've seen since the Arab Spring of 2011 is that the monarchies, for whatever reason, have largely withstood the winds of change. Morocco, the Gulf states were very minimally affected by this, some impact, but not very much. Jordan has its own set of issues internally, but still has managed to avoid any deep internal issues. But some key players, and of course Iraq was affected first by years of sanctions and misrule by Saddam and a series of wars, and then American-British invasion and occupation, and the regime that came after that not really establishing itself in terms of good governance and Iranian influence and all sorts of things. And the civil war in Syria that has torn the country apart and continues to rage while the Arab world around it looks on aghast, but doesn't seem to have any ability to stop it.
Thank you.
One other point I'd like to make: there are cynics who will say, "Oh, this is just the developing world. This is the third world. That's all they do." Whereas I think the implicit assumption of your question is actually not. If you look at South America, if you look at Southeast Asia, for example, there are countries who are able to manage previous conflicts actually pretty well.
Yeah. I mean, the United States is closely aligned with both Saudi Arabia and Egypt, and these are terrible police states. Are these not unholy alliances? Is it really necessary that the US aligns itself to regimes which are, well, very questionable indeed?
I would say the question is what would take their place if the current regimes fell, and would that necessarily be better, first of all, for our interests, because I want to consider this from an American perspective of our national interest, but also for the citizens of those states. I was in Egypt during the one-year period of Muslim Brotherhood rule, and it was a catastrophe. The Muslim Brotherhood prepared itself for decades to take power. They managed to take advantage of the overthrow of Hosni Mubarak, largely led by other people. But they were better organized, and they then were able to win the elections. But once they came into power, they had no idea how to run a country, and especially had no idea how to manage an economy of a country the size of Egypt. And their foreign policy was a terrible mess. And I think the Obama administration faced a huge dilemma what to do when the military came back and retook power and threw out and imprisoned the Brotherhood. But I will say my personal opinion is that Egypt is better off for all the difficulties under Sisi than they would have been if the Brotherhood had stayed in power. That's my personal view. Saudi Arabia has always been a dilemma for us. We have always, I served in the embassy in Riyadh in the late 1990s, and I used to joke with my embassy team that we should have T-shirts printed that would say, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, we share interests but not values. That is fundamentally true. We have never shared values, but we have certainly shared interests. The question is, as we no longer really depend on imported oil, and as gradually the world economy is moving away from fossil fuels, what's going to happen to the U.S.-Saudi relationship? And that's not very clear.
But isn't there a difference whether one recognizes one's common values or whether one hobnobs with a crown prince who seems to have given the order to kill one of his own citizens in a consulate abroad? one can appreciate the interest without being close friends at the same time. So why is that difference not being drawn by politicians in the US?
Yes, that is the real challenge for the United States and other countries. I completely agree with what Mark said. These neither, as examples, neither Egypt nor Saudi Arabia were able to govern themselves in the way that the Arab awakening had hoped that they might be able to. The progressive liberal forces that promoted the Arab Spring, the Arab awakening in Egypt, evaporated. As soon as the Muslim Brotherhood came to power. And the same thing in Saudi Arabia. There's no there in terms of governance other than the party. That does not absolve the party, the family. That does not absolve the United States, in particular, of having well thought out diplomatic strategies that address an overall policy that's agreed upon across our government, and then strategies to carry out that policy with using all of the instruments of our national power to deal with all of it's complex. So all of the different issues we have the various means to do many things all at once, not just coddling up to dictators or watching a revolution take over.
Thank you. Let's briefly talk about Iran. It seems to me the nuclear treaty was, of course, not perfect, clearly not. But it seems that at least the treaty provided an element of stability in the Western world's relations with Iran. And that stability has now given place to turmoil, to the threat of war, even to assassinations. And that doesn't seem to be better what was there before, as imperfect as it may have been. Or how do you see the situation?
I believe that the nuclear agreement was far more, quote, perfect, unquote, than we like to give it credit. When one makes an agreement with an adversary, you don't get everything you want. The adversary has interests as well. Anybody who tries to buy a house knows that you can't just say, well, I'd like this house for 3 cents and I want everything in it. It is a negotiation. And I think the result achieved all of the interests of the United States in terms of Iran's nuclear agreement and the nuclear agreement in terms of Iran's nuclear program, and the agreement achieved all of Iran's interests in terms of getting rid of sanctions and trying to demonstrate that it really doesn't need a nuclear weapons program, and therefore we can give up this, that, and the other. It was never meant to deal with all of the other behaviors of Iran, which would never have resulted in any kind of comprehensive agreement unless the United States was willing to do things that we would never have done.
I'll offer a different point of view. I think the JCPOA was deeply flawed. I think it was premised on an expectation, and I heard very senior administration officials argue this shortly before the agreement was concluded, that Iran would take the windfall of funds that were released as a result of the deal and use them for the development of their economy and for the improvement of the standard of living of their people. And that's not what happened. They used the money to finance the IRGC's campaign of subversion and killing throughout the region, particularly in Syria, but also in Iraq. And their deployment of Lebanese Hezbollah, which is supposed to be a Lebanese organization, as a primary factor in saving the Assad regime in Syria, and launching themselves into a war in Yemen, which involved no direct Iranian interest at all, but was an opportunity that they saw to undermine Saudi Arabia. So I do think that all these other issues that David alluded to that were not deliberately left out of the JCPOA negotiations came back to haunt us in very serious ways. The other problem is, as I see it, the Obama administration argued that the JCPOA had permanently blocked Iran from pursuing a nuclear weapon, knowing full well that that wasn't true. It blocked it for a period of 10 to 15 years, which by the way that Middle Easterners calculate time is not a very long period.
What is the way forward?
That's a very good question.
Answer it.
I think that pressure on Iran has achieved some of its objectives, and as I said in my remarks, it's been much more effective than a lot of people thought, but it's not an answer in and of itself. Sooner or later, we need a dialogue with Iran again. I think the U.S. and the main European powers need to come to an understanding again about what way forward there is, given that the agreement is effectively dead. I think there needs to be some way to factor in the interests of our friends in the region as well, which we very deliberately did not do in the original negotiations.
Thank you. David, what is the way forward?
To go back to the agreement, to the JCPOA, to reconstruct it, to reestablish all of the guardrails, all of the commitments that Iran makes in terms of inspections, in terms of its the amount of plutonium that it has, and all of the centrifuges, et cetera, to go back to that, which is going to take some time, and then also to deal with all of the behaviors that never stopped, in fact, became even more aggressive after the collapse of the accord, vis-a-vis Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is now effectively in charge of the country, Iran's position in Iraq, ditto. Yemen is a problem that needs to be solved in and of itself, and there are other solutions to that, which the United States needs to push more aggressively, and it's not by killing people. There are diplomatic ways to try to solve the Yemen problem, and then to get back to an attitude that a moderate Iran that wants to live peacefully in its neighborhood without threatening the other peoples of the region is a policy that the Iranian government itself and its next president, well, I'm not sure that's going to happen, but, well, we blew that. But if we could get a demonstration that it was Rouhani's moderate approach, relatively, don't get me wrong here, Castro did a lot of good things too. A relatively moderate approach is far better than allowing the IRGC to have bragging rights. You see, we told you. You make a deal with the Americans, they're going to stab you in the back. Not only they stab you in the back, they stab us in the back directly too. So it is not a recipe for success to promote the fortunes of hardline, basically the IRGC, which effectively controls the economy. And I would only argue that the dynamic that one could hope for is not that there's going to be a change, that flowers and peace and freedom are going to break out, but that perhaps a dynamic over the 12, 15, 20 years of Iran after the death of the supreme leader, and with perhaps a new dynamic in opening up elections to more people rather than closing them down, which is what they're doing now, might have had a better impact. So we need to turn the ship around, not head to China, but turn the ship around and try to get back to where we were, where moderation, peace, respect for others is the watchword.
Back to the future.
Yeah.
What about Syria? We see a marginalization of the United States. We see increasing involvement by Turkey and Russia, and we see, as you rightly said, no end to the war. What are we doing about that? That has, of course, also caused a lot of problems for the Western world, not least for the Europeans. Huge refugee waves, which have increased neo-nationalism and the right-wing movements in Europe. So it's not causing just problems for the Middle East, which is bad enough, of course, but it's spreading increasingly. So the urgency clearly is obvious. What are we going to do? Can I ask Mark?
I don't know, because I can tell you there's no taste in Washington for a greater U.S. involvement in Syria, even though many of the people individually who have worked on Syria very fervently would like to see that happen. I don't see it happening. It certainly isn't on President Trump's priorities. In fact, I saw his press conference in New Delhi, and he was just talking again about how he's minimized our presence in Syria, and it's all about protecting the oil. But I don't see that a Democrat president would likely have a very different, more interventionist policy. I don't believe so much the United States has been marginalized as that we have decided on our own that we're not currently interested in much greater involvement in Syria, and that may be a shame, but it seems to me the reality. And at the same time, the Arab world doesn't know what to do about it. They've been struggling with this for 8-9 years now, and they have no solution. And I know it affects people very emotionally, but they just don't know what to do. I don't, David?
I agree with that analysis. And here I blame the Obama administration for failing to establish a goal, a strategy, a policy vis-a-vis Syria that had a reasonable chance of an outcome to the favor of the United States. We set up, I believe, we set ourselves up for failure by turning our sights away from the Assad regime and toward the military elimination of the Islamic State, which we succeeded in doing, but set ourselves up for a situation in which the United States and our Kurdish and some Arab allies were on one side of the Euphrates River, and the Syrian government, the Russians, and the Iranians were on the other side. Well, now what do? The United States has no authority to take over that part of the world. Syria does, that part of Syria, excuse me. The Syrian government does. It is still the legitimate authority. Unless you had moved to challenge the authority of the Assad regime in 2012, as we started to do, I believe there was some reason to believe that the United States could have made an impact. We might have failed, but we didn't even try. And now it's too late. It is now in the hands of Turkey, Russia, Iraq, and Iran and the Syrians. So there's nothing we can do about this.
Thank you for this sober assessment. 2 more questions before we open it up. You mentioned the Qatar problem.
Oh, yeah.
Enlighten us. What is that all about, and how can that be overcome?
I think it will fade out gradually of its own, but it is an interesting case study in intra-Gulf dynamics. There is Qatar is a relatively new state, and it became fabulously wealthy in a very short period of time. It has vast natural gas resources and a very small population. And there is a dynastic division in the Qatari royal family that the Saudis, who are related in many ways to many of the Qataris, and the Qataris, at least in theory, are also Wahhabis. The Saudis sought to play in the dynastic changes in Qatar and failed, and the branch of the family that they didn't like held on to power, and that's been a thorn in the side of the Saudis for years. That's been compounded since the Arab Spring by Qatar's alliance with Turkey in support of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and then in support of the Muslim Brotherhood more broadly as an international movement after the army retook power. And that drove the Emiratis crazy, because the Emiratis' number one enemy is actually not Iran, it's the Muslim Brotherhood. So those things all combined. After the Trump administration came in, I think the Saudis and the Emiratis felt that they had a good friend in the White House, and that they could basically do what they wanted to do, and they tried to, once again, it's not the first time, to overthrow the Qatari leadership and replace them with a different branch of the family, and they failed. And what they've done by imposing a blockade of sorts, a land blockade anyway, and closing their airspace, is that they drove all of the Qataris into backing the young Emir Tamim, and he's become a national hero, and he's stronger than he ever was. So this is a failed policy. The sooner they abandon it, the better, but it's not easy for them.
Thank you. Sounds like a simple problem.
Well, yeah, and let me add two other simple issues to this. You may or may not recall that map I showed of the geological formations in the Gulf. Well, Qatar has this gigantic gas field. It is one of the world's largest producers of gas, which it shares with Iran. Mm-hmm. So the Qataris are not going to do anything to poke a sharp stick in the eye of the Iranians. And by the way, the United Arab Emirates, which is in huge feud with Qatar as well, and they have been for quite a while. The UAE, in particular, Abu Dhabi and Dubai, get their gas from Qatar. So, I mean, this is a family feud. That they will get back together again. They will kiss and make up, and then they'll go back to fighting again. But it's complicated by the fact that the Qataris are really cut off in economic and commercial terms from the rest of the world, because they are sanctioned by their Arab neighbors. So everything they do in terms of commercial networks and commercial aviation networks and commercial maritime networks have to go to the side of the Iranians and back in that direction. It's a mess.
And through Oman, which has benefited tremendously from this.
That's the reason you're still living there.
No, not entirely, but...
A new peace plan has been produced for Israel and Palestine. Is that the solution? Are we now looking forward to an end of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Let me give this one a shot. Probably not. I know there were many people in Washington who advised President Trump to put not release the plan, that the timing didn't seem particularly auspicious. That may have been good advice, but he did decide to do it anyway. I do think it's probably time to try some new ideas and to get away from the post-Oslo formulas, which have never worked. But I'm not sure. I think there are some interesting elements in this, but there's probably not enough for the Palestinians to see much point in pursuing it. And the Arab world, for all that it, broadly speaking, has moved away from Israel-Palestine as its primary concern, is still rhetorically committed to the Palestinian cause, and they're not likely to abandon that anytime soon. So I don't think it's likely to go very far. But there are some interesting ideas in it.
Some people say Trump just copied the Israeli plans. Is there anything in them?
Well, certainly they spoke a lot to Prime Minister Netanyahu. I think there are things in there that aren't particularly palatable, at least to some of the elements of Netanyahu's coalition either. So I doubt it's that simple, but it certainly does contain some Israeli ideas in it.
David,
I would say the plan has a snowball's chance in Wadi Rum of succeeding. It is, just the whole concept is flawed from the beginning. But I would say that the problems between Israel and the Palestinians are a large part the psychology of how your adversary appears to you. And whenever your adversary actually appears to you as a person with whom you might be able to deal, then everything becomes possible. And we saw that after Oslo, after 1993, not just because of the Oslo Agreement itself, but because of the Israeli government and what the Israeli government did to try to produce, along with all of the other Arab nations, a psychology of the possible. And as long as Yitzhak Rabin was in charge of, was Prime Minister of Israel, everything was possible, including in the UAE where I was. The Emiratis were really thinking, well, this actually may work, as did the Qataris and even the Omanis, that we may actually have something here. And when Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated, that image effectively evaporated. Don't forget that preceding that was a Madrid peace process led by Secretary Baker and George H.W. Bush, and bringing together at the negotiating table Israel with all of the Arab states to include the likes of Syria. So we had all sorts of possibilities. But whenever the psychology takes over that our negotiating partners, the adversaries across the table, are not going to do anything, then there is no hope for a negotiated peace. We have to get back to that psychology.
Thank you. I have to ask you, because you, I believe, served under Clinton and George W. Bush, you served under Obama and Trump. Did that matter for the people on the ground? Was there a difference according to who was in charge in the White House?
You mean over the course of my career?
No, during the end of when you were ambassador and then in Florida at the Central Command?
Effectively, yes, because the George W. Bush Defense Department ran with an Iraq policy that was destined to ignore the wishes or the desires or the fears or the wants of the Sunni minority of Iraq, and I think that it took a lot of effort to try to bring bring Iraq, all these various Iraqi groups together. This is a long story, and we don't have enough time to do it. The situation under the Clinton administration was completely different. I mean, it was a different world, a different era before 9/11. I mean, how the Defense Department might have acted in the Clinton era, it's hard to say, or how a Gore presidency might have handled the 2001. I don't have any clue. It's likely to have been different because you would not have had the lineup in the Defense Department as we did. That's a simple view.
I feel very fortunate that as ambassador, and I did bridge the Obama and the Trump administrations, but I must say I worked for the Obama administration in its last year in office, and so it was gradually fading from the scene, but still I think the primary difference had to do with Iran policy very clearly, but I feel fortunate that there was very little micromanaging of my embassy by either administration, and I was largely able to set the agenda for our relations with Oman, probably because the Trump administration really wasn't paying a lot of attention to Oman. But I did see the change in the Iran policy coming. I was able to counsel the Omanis about how to deal with that, and I think they were very appreciative and grateful for that. Even if they didn't like the change, it wasn't a surprise.
And you said that the change which affected you was a change in the State Department rather than in the White House.
It didn't affect me so much, but here I don't mind saying that the biggest problem the State Department had in the beginning of the Trump administration was actually Secretary Tillerson, who I don't know what he thought he was doing, but effectively tried to take the State Department apart brick by brick, and then found he really couldn't do that, and then was removed by the president, I think, thankfully. Most of the problems, there were some problems with morale at State having to do with the administration more broadly in the White House, but the most serious problems stemmed from Secretary Tillerson's unwillingness to engage the people of the department and his effort to keep everybody at arm's length. I still don't understand it, but that was pretty bad.
Thank you very much. Let's open it to questions from the audience. Yeah. This gentleman there.
Question for Mark. You hear that...
There's a microphone coming in. Could you stand up? That's easier to hear.
You hear in the Trump administration that they don't fill all of the ambassadorial positions. Is that the case, or in the Middle East, are they mainly filled?
By now, yes. There was, again, I don't want to blame everything on Secretary Tillerson, but I will blame a lot of it on him. Initially, there was just no effort to fill either the senior positions at State or many of the key ambassadorships, and so they just sat, and many of my colleagues who were assigned to posts as Deputy Chiefs of Mission were elevated into the position of being chargé d'affaires, in other words, the senior person in the embassy. But I think that being chargé, and I was chargé in Cairo at the end for about 7 months, is probably the most difficult job in the whole Foreign Service, because you have all of the responsibility of an ambassador, and certainly if something goes wrong, the buck stops with you. But you don't have all the authority of an ambassador. You don't have it with the host government. You don't have it with the State Department. So it's a very hard job to do well. I think most of the senior positions and ambassadorial positions have been filled subsequently under Secretary Pompeo. So I don't think it's nearly as serious, but there was a long interregnum. In some key states, we didn't have an ambassador for almost 2 years.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, please. Yeah.
I hope that it's useful to mention this. You went through almost an hour and a half without mentioning on what can go wrong, will go wrong basis, the 800-pound bear in the room, which would be Russia. You just at the end mentioned, and I was wondering if you have an overview of Russian influence in that region, considering that it can be polysurgically precise, as we had discovered in our elections and other things.
Thank you.
I'll try first.
Yeah, Russian influence in the Middle East, generally speaking, now is episodic. They try wherever they can to get a foothold, to be tactically engaged, transactionally engaged. The one place they have had some significant success has been Syria. And the reason they've been successful in Syria, in large part, has to do with the history of post-World War II history of Soviet relations with the Syrian governments. Syria was a Russian ally in the Middle East for a long time, until Gorbachev made it not so anymore. So now the Russians are getting back into Syria, and I believe that their presence there is really very, again, transactional. It's designed to show two things. One, that Russia is a power, and two, that Russia does not abandon its friends. It's really important to them. The subtext is America abandons its friends all the time, but Russia does not. This is part of the reason Russia was involved in Afghanistan a long time ago. So this is, unlike Iran's role in Syria, which is very tangible. They need that the Syrian territory to cross between Iran and Lebanon and the Eastern Mediterranean.
I completely agree with that. I would add one thought, which is with regard to the Gulf, the Russian interest is entirely transactional. Russia has very little to offer anyone other than very close allies like Bashar al-Assad, except advanced weaponry. And they do try to sell air defense systems to anybody who's willing to consider it. The much more serious challenge to U.S. interests in the Gulf comes from China. And China has a long-term plan, I think, to attract and develop a presence all along the Persian Gulf and down into Africa. And they're through the Belt and Road Initiative, and they're very, very committed to it. They may now be running out of money to do it. They have other internal problems they didn't have a couple of years ago. But the challenge, from my point of view, from China is much more serious, and especially when you talk about building 5G infrastructure and the dangers of Huawei and so forth.
Let me play devil's advocate. What's wrong with economic competition? Is that not what a capitalist market economy always wants?
Economic competition is a good thing. It's just fine. The problem is the Chinese don't play by the same rules.
David, you want to come into that?
No, I totally agree. In fact, I think we squandered our opportunity to dominate the rule-making book, the rule-making council for a global economy when we failed to sign on to the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
I agree.
And China stepped in. So we abdicated that role, and they took competition and ran with it, but wrote the rules themselves, so now people have to pay by their rules. I don't know enough about the Huawei issue. I've heard both sides to it, that they're really evil and they're listening to us right now, or the British approach, which is this is something we can deal with.
Mm-hmm. And in the Gulf states and in the Middle East, in what way can China be a danger, a threat, a competitor to the US in a geopolitical way?
Again, in China, developing the kinds of technologies that many of the Gulf states are hungry for and are working a little bit on their own, but basically allowing other nations to work there, such as in Dubai and Abu Dhabi and their free zones, their media free zone, etc. They want the absolute greatest, latest, and best, and we're not going to provide it. The Chinese will. Now, what is the impact of that? I don't know, except Chinese systems will be dominating the hemispheric, the global commercial networks that the Gulf represents, and not the United States or even Europe, but we'd rather have the United States in commercial terms. Talking solely in commercial terms, I don't know that this is an evil empire about to take over the world. It's just economic competition that we're going to lose.
Okay, thank you. More questions, please. Yes, there. To your right. Can you stand up, please?
Yeah, of course. Trying to. Okay, good.
It's working.
Yeah. As former ambassadors to Middle Eastern countries, did y'all ever feel obligated to adhere to Islamic practices and customs beyond the law?
It's an ambassador's job to show respect for the host country's traditions and culture. It's something else. I remember years ago, there's always been an argument at the embassy in Riyadh on what the expectation is for American women, and particularly American women officers, in terms of dress. And we have a dilemma because, we expect people in the State Department to dress professionally, but we have no mandate, nor should we tell them that they have to wear an abaya or a head cover. And at least when I was in the embassy in Riyadh, our position was that women could choose what their preference was, but we would not impose it on anybody. It can be a problem. On the other hand, in Oman, I think most embassies do this during Ramadan. Hosting an iftar in the ambassador's residence is a lot of fun, and it shows respect, and I don't think that it compromises our own principles in any way.
No, I totally agree. By the way, you didn't mention this, I am a graduate of Carolina history, so it really works out. Foreign Service, good for you, please.
And UNC is good for you.
Yeah. But and that was a long time ago. That was back.
Don't mention.
Quality has gone up.
Yes, absolutely. The only time, let's say, that women would be covered is if you go into a mosque. But that's the same thing if you go into a church in Europe. You're expected to be respectful, not to wear shorts or sandals or anything like that. It's really the same thing. And I would echo what Mark has said about respecting Islamic practices. This is in part showing respect for the culture, and it's very good for us as stewards of American policy and of learning about their culture, is to participate in it, to go to Ramadan, for example, Ramadan evening meals, iftars, sitting with influential people who are they all go to visit each other, and this is a good time to socialize, to meet other people. And you go with the flow, and this is very, very valuable, but not to the extent of, I think, what was underlining your question in terms of some of the harsher aspects of Islamic tradition.
Thank you. More questions, please. Have we exhausted you?
No, there's one there.
There's one, okay.
Hey, I am a Gilman and CLS alumni. I used Gilman to go to actually the UAE and Jordan, and I used CLS to go to Oman.
Oh, great.
What is the embassy's role in international education, especially for language learning?
The embassy's role, at least in Oman, the embassy's role has been promoting higher education in the United States. We have an education fair. Actually, the Omanis have an education fair every year, but we actively encourage American universities and colleges to come and present their programs and try to attract students. In our public diplomacy, we certainly emphasize the growing number of Omani students in American universities, and I think it's a very, very important connection between the societies. We used to have a senior high school English language program where we brought students to the United States for high school. But that was canceled. I think sometimes the level of maturity of the students, they ran into some difficulties, and I think it was mutually agreed that maybe it didn't work very well at that level. But I'm a big believer in the value of American higher education in narrowing the gaps between cultures.
Here I will give a plug to my wife, Beatrice. While I was off to Baghdad in 2005, she competed for and was sent to Kabul, Afghanistan, in the position of the English language program officer, which is a position at our embassies, usually regional, but in the case of Kabul, it was for Afghanistan only, to assess the capabilities of Afghanistan to teach English, whether at the university level, high school level, private sector, other countries like Iran and Pakistan teaching English, and what are they teaching there? And then to assess what are their curriculum needs, teacher training needs, material needs, and that sort of thing. So the United States has a tool that sometimes we don't use as aggressively as we should be to help nations, especially nations like Afghanistan, trying to break out of the grip of poverty, to learn English so they can relate to much of the rest of the world.
Thank you. The United States has almost become self-sufficient in oil and gas. Does that explain a certain reticence, to put it politely, to engage in the Middle East, to perhaps withdraw from the Middle East, like in Syria, or is that not connected with each other at all?
I think there is a connection, but I think it can be overstated as well. I think much of the reticence is more a result of Americans' disappointment and frustration with the outcome of the wars the war that we won in Iraq, but then lost the peace, and the war in Afghanistan that has never been won and probably never can be. And I think people are just tired of it. It probably also helps that we don't need the oil the way that we used to, but I don't think that's really the primary issue. I don't know.
Yeah, I would agree that the reduced dependence of the United States and other countries, but especially the United States, on oil and gas should be a reason for the United States to demilitarize its policies toward the Middle East, to the point where we use our security capabilities surgically. That where we need a military intervention, then we engage in a military intervention, but it is no longer in order to secure America's need for oil. Now, that does not mitigate the need of other countries of the world for oil and gas. And what we want to do is, as in the 1940s, the right policy is to make sure that there is that the market for oil is as open as possible to all people who want to buy and sell it.
Thank you. Any more questions? You have a final question then for you.
I was just going to, no one had mentioned, barely.
Can you wait for the microphone?
No one had barely mentioned the Kurds. Do you see a future, not a state, of course, but what is your views for a future for the Kurdish people?
The Kurdish people are highly unlikely to have a Kurdish state where all Kurds are in one new independent state, as was conceived in 1919. That's not going to happen, in large part because 5 countries will be opposed to it, the 5 countries that have large Kurdish populations. Therefore, what we need to support, what the United States should support, and our other allies, is that the Kurdish people's expectations of freedom, respect for human rights, education of their children, respect for their practices, their language, etc., should be respected, recognized, implemented in these countries, so that they are parts of the country in which they live, whether that's Syria or Iraq or Turkey or Iran. And
I think the Iraqi case is maybe a bit different in that the Kurds have been effectively self-ruling in Iraq since the 1990s, and they have developed many of the institutions of a state, but they're still part of the Iraqi Republic. I work very closely with Kurds in both my postings in Iraq. I have enormous sympathy for them. I think they're great people and they're great allies of the United States. But I do agree that the possibilities of Kurdish independence are severely constrained by geography and the opposition of all of the neighboring countries. And I think Barzani made a big mistake with the referendum. When was that? 2 years ago, because there was no question that most Kurds wanted independence, and 2, there was no question that the neighbors, including Baghdad, would allow it to be implemented. So
we can't forget that the road to Iraqi Kurdistan was rocky. That in the 1990s, the Kurds were killing each other. That Barzani's and Taliban's Kurds were killing each other. In fact, I personally went to on a mission from the White House and the State Department to negotiate a peace between them. It took a long time, but they did work it out. Iraqi Kurds are different than Syrian Kurds with different issues. Way different than Turkish Kurds with different issues. And we don't talk about the Iranian Kurds very much because they have problems as well.
Before we let you go, another question about Iraq. You know, Iraq is in turmoil. Hundreds of thousands died in the war, and terrorism has flourished since Saddam Hussein. So would it have been better to leave Saddam Hussein in power instead of removing him?
You know, the hindsight questions are always impossible to answer. Saddam, I think, was a very, very serious threat to international peace and security. I think sooner or later the sanctions regime and the limits on Iraq's ability to produce weapons of mass destruction were eroding very quickly, and they would have collapsed entirely. And I think he would have immediately resumed production of chemical weapons and other forms of weaponry if he could have. And his track record.
Can't be sure.
No, we can't be sure. It's certainly true that that terrible things have happened since the fall of Saddam's regime, but we shouldn't forget the terrible things that happened under Saddam, the gassing of Kurds, the mass graves, the massacres of Shia Iraqis in southern Iraq, and Saddam's constant maneuvers to undermine his neighbors and threaten his neighbors. So it's just an impossible question to answer. I just wish that Iraq stabilizes soon and that Iraqis who greatly deserve a decent government, which at the moment they don't seem to have.
David?
I completely disagree with the premise that hindsight is hard to do. I think it's easy to do. I totally agree with our policy to remove Saddam Hussein. It's just that the way we did, in fact, there was a very elaborate plan developed by the Department of State as to what a post-Iraq should look like across all dimensions, and that was thrown out by the Defense Department. So it was the way we did it. I was the director of Iran-Iraq affairs throughout the middle of the 1990s. My concern was not what we knew about Iraq's programs, chemical and biological weapons programs. It's what we didn't know about them, that we found out surreptitiously. We found out just because inspectors stumbled upon these things and Saddam had lied about them at every stage. So it was what we didn't know that scared me. And after 10 years of this, finally, the template of the international community getting together to say enough for a state like Saddam Hussein, you're game over. Your time is over. You are no longer in power. But to do it collaboratively, collectively, and the way the State Department had envisaged, we just blew the whole game in the fourth inning.
But was there a legal justification? The UN did not agree to the invasion, and the international community wasn't as united as you just said. Some were vigorously opposed, in quite a few countries. So, and what was the legal justification?
Well, it becomes a dilemma of the nature of the Security Council when you have Russia, China, and at that time France all completely opposed to what the United States was trying to do. We in the British decided that since we could not get the support of the Security Council, we were going to do it anyway.
But that wasn't legal, was it?
I'm not an international lawyer. I wouldn't be.
It would have been much better. It clearly would have been much better. But I'll tell you what, that every time the Russians defended, or the French defended Saddam Hussein, Saddam would turn around and do something really stupid. And then they would say, hey, you just did something stupid. We are now going to put on yet the next resolution against you. And then they would defend him, and then he'd go off and do something stupid again. And at the end of the day, it was really, this becomes I think what Mark is trying to say is that the Security Council did not serve the interests of the globe. Now, how we handled it in the Security Council. I don't know, should we have done a better job? Perhaps. But to this day, the international community needs a way to deal with a state that refuses to accept international norms despite all of our efforts after many, many, many years. We have to have an ultimate sanction. We need one. We can't just go on forever like this. My view.
We agree on this.
I would like to thank Ambassador David, Ambassador Mark Seelers, and of course you for staying on for so long. Thank you very much.